Okay, I want you to think back to the last time you seriously decided, right, I'm going to learn a new language.
Uh-huh.
Maybe you grabbed an app, Duolingo or something. Maybe you even bought a dusty textbook or stood in front of the mirror trying to nail hola or
We've
konnichiwa.
all been there.
It's tough, isn't it? And let's be honest, most of us, we quit. The effort right now just feels massive compared to this vague payoff way down the line.
Yeah, you do the mental calculations.
Yeah.
The time, the sheer frustration.
Exactly. And you think, is all this hassle really worth it? Just so I can, I don't know, order a slightly fancier coffee on that one vacation I might take in 3 years? Or use it like once every 5 years?
It is like the ultimate generator of the sunk cost fallacy, isn't it? You
Yeah.
pour in hundreds of hours, potentially, and yet years later, you still get that little jolt of panic if the phone rings and you have to answer in that language.
Oh, completely. That feeling of just not being quite good enough. That's what trips most people up, I think.
It really does.
But what if we told you that the real value, the core benefit of learning that new language has almost nothing to do with ordering coffee or
Mhm.
even getting that specific promotion overseas?
Hmm.
What if the actual undeniable benefit is something much bigger, like a fundamental operating system upgrade for your brain, affecting everything from, say, your basic memory capacity to how creative you are, measurably creative, and even how rationally you handle your money?
Okay, that is exactly what we're digging into today. This is our deep dive mission, uncovering the unexpected, often overlooked cognitive benefits of learning any language, even if you never get remotely close to native fluency.
Right. And our anchor for this discussion isn't just anecdotal stuff. We're basing this on some pretty hefty research.
Absolutely. This is grounded in a really comprehensive research initiative cited by the British Academy. And this wasn't just a quick look at existing papers. They commissioned a full systematic review, a huge meta-analysis, and they also brought in feedback from all sorts of stakeholder surveys, focus groups, the works.
So they weren't just looking at the usual suspects, like does learning French improve your English literacy or your ability to multitask a bit better?
Exactly. They consciously pushed beyond those typical metrics. They looked into areas we don't often link directly with language study. Things like creativity, social and affective cognition, so how you manage emotions, how you interact with people, and even the specific cognitive perks you might get from learning sign language.
Interesting.
So our goal here is to really distill what the hard science is telling us about this brain upgrade and maybe, just maybe, convince you why you should absolutely pick up that language app again.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning then, because even the words we use here are shifting, and that shift actually changes how we think about success, doesn't it? We tend to throw around bilingual and multilingual almost interchangeably.
I do.
But the research itself is pushing towards a different concept, one that's maybe more dynamic and honestly a bit more forgiving for us learners.
That's a crucial point. We really need to clarify the difference because it matters for policy, but it also matters for you, the individual learner, and how you frame your goals.
Yeah.
Multilingualism usually refers to, languages coexisting, either socially, like in a country like Switzerland, or just within one person having multiple languages.
Okay.
But the research really encourages us to use the term plurilingualism.
Plurilingualism, okay. Sounds a bit academic, maybe a little intimidating.
It sounds like it, but actually the concept behind it is quite liberating, I think.
How so?
Well, plurilingualism focuses on the individual's language resources. It's about their dynamic, uneven, and constantly changing linguistic repertoire.
Okay. Dynamic, uneven changing. What does uneven mean in this context?
Uneven is the key word there. It acknowledges reality. You might be fantastic at reading highly technical French articles for work, right? But maybe you can only just about stumble through ordering food on the streets of Paris. And perhaps, from a summer job years ago, you picked up some incredibly colorful, idiomatic Portuguese swear words, but not much else.
Right. I know people like that.
Exactly. That whole messy, uneven, shifting collection of skills and knowledge across different languages, that is your plurilingual repertoire. It's not about perfect balance.
So success isn't about achieving this perfectly symmetrical, native-like command of two distinct language systems, like two separate boxes in your head.
Precisely. The big idea the research promotes is seeing plurilingualism not as some rare exception, but as the norm. The goal isn't necessarily to become bilingual in that old-fashioned perfect sense.
Mm.
It's about expanding your repertoire, adding tools to your linguistic toolbox.
Mm.
And when you frame it like that, it immediately emphasizes the value, cognitive, social, cultural plurality that your unique, messy, dynamic language profile brings. It's not about hitting some impossible standard of perfection. It's about growth and expansion.
Hmm.
And that, I think, takes a huge amount of pressure off learners who feel like they have to be flawless or it doesn't count.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Let's move into the direct brain benefits then, the stuff we can actually measure. Starting with the one most people have probably heard something about, executive function, EF. That's kind of the baseline, right?
Yeah, EF is the brain's sort of air traffic control system. It covers things like cognitive flexibility, switching between tasks smoothly, what people often call multitasking, and also controlling your attention, filtering out distractions. And the research absolutely confirmed that the public gets this connection.
People actually know this. Like, if you ask them, they connect language learning with better thinking.
They really do,
Yeah.
overwhelmingly. The adult questionnaire data they gathered for this report was striking. Get this, 92% of the people they asked agreed or strongly agreed that learning a new language helps develop thinking and analytical skills. That was question one.
92%. Wow.
And then, question two, 88% believed it helped develop multitasking skills. So, yeah, the idea that juggling languages helps you juggle thoughts is pretty well embedded in how people think about it.
Okay, so we know those EF benefits are real and widely believed. But you mentioned the academic focus has often been a bit narrow, mostly just on EF tests. What happens when we look broader? Let's tackle a big one first, something that stops people even before they start. This idea of language aptitude. I'm just not wired for languages. Is that true? Is aptitude fixed?
Uh, this is, for me, one of the most exciting findings
Uh,
because it directly fights that defeatist thinking. The research powerfully argues against the fixed trait model. Language aptitude isn't some predetermined ceiling you hit. It's actually a set of skills. And like skills, they can be trained, they can be developed, it's malleable.
okay, malleable. So break down what aptitude actually means in this context. It's not just like having a good memory for vocabulary, is it?
No, it's more complex than that. It's generally seen as having a few key components. First, there's phonetic coding ability, basically,
Yeah.
how well you can hear subtle differences in new sounds and then reproduce them.
Second, grammatical sensitivity. That's your knack for recognizing how words function in a sentence, like spotting the verb or the object without explicitly knowing the rule. Third is inductive reasoning. Your ability to figure out grammatical patterns or rules just from examples you hear or read.
Inferring the rules.
Exactly. And fourth, rote memory. Yes, memory is part of it, specifically the ability to quickly learn and recall associations, like word pairs.
Right, that breakdown makes sense. So how does the research actually show that, say, struggling through French class doesn't just teach you French, but actually makes you fundamentally better at learning German later? Not just because some words are similar, but because you've literally trained those four underlying abilities.
That's the plasticity argument in action. The research demonstrates that these components, phonetic coding, grammatical sensitivity, etc., they're surprisingly malleable. They can improve because you're engaged in the learning process itself. The key example they often cite involved Hungarian learners.
Yes, the intensive English program study. Exactly. They compared students in a really intensive English program with peers in a more standard, regular course.
Wow.
They measured their aptitude scores before and after.
Yeah.
The students in the intensive course showed significantly greater increases in those aptitude scores across the board compared to the regular group. The sheer intensity of exposure, the constant cognitive workout, it physically developed their underlying aptitude for language learning itself. Their ability to spot rules got better, their memory encoding got faster, their ear for new sounds sharpened.
That's actually huge. It completely flips the script, doesn't it? From, oh, I'm just bad at languages, to, okay, my brain hasn't had the right training yet. It means learning a language isn't just learning content, it's meta-learning. It's training yourself to be a better learner. Full stop.
Precisely. And this training effect connects directly to another key cognitive function, working memory, WM.
Right, WRM, that's like the brain's temporary RAM, right? The mental workspace where you hold and juggle information.
Exactly. It lets you hold the beginning of a sentence in mind while you process the end, for example. And working memory capacity is highlighted across the research as key evidence of this plasticity we're talking about, especially in bilinguals, and this applies across all age groups.
And working memory is what allows that air traffic controller, the executive function, to actually do its job filtering and switching.
That's right. WM provides the capacity you need to control your attention, to keep two language systems active, but inhibit the one you're not using at that moment. That constant mental juggling, the inhibition practice, that's the workout.
And again, the public seems to get this intuitively, too.
They do. Back to the survey data. 90% agreed or strongly agreed that language learning helps improve memory. So people feel it, even if they don't use the term working memory plasticity.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. We've done immediate cognitive function. What about the big one, the one that grabs headlines? Health, longevity, fighting off cognitive decline as we age. Does learning German actually help you stave off dementia?
Right, this brings us to the concept of cognitive reserve. This is a really significant hypothesis in aging research. The core idea is that engaging in complex, mentally demanding activities in foreign language learning definitely qualifies, especially for older adults, helps build up this reserve.
How does that work? What is cognitive reserve, practically speaking?
Think of it like building extra processing power or alternative routes in your brain. Language learning activates really extensive brain networks. It's not just one language spot. It involves memory systems, executive control, attention networks, even motor skills if you're writing or signing.
Okay.
Now, crucially, these networks heavily overlap with the brain regions that are known to be negatively affected by aging and diseases like Alzheimer's. So, by strengthening these networks through language learning, you're essentially building redundancy and resilience. If one pathway starts to degrade due to age or disease, you have stronger alternative pathways ready to compensate.
And this is the idea that gets amplified a lot in what the report calls the gray literature. Maybe define that for us.
Sure. Gray literature basically refers to sources outside the traditional peer-reviewed academic journals. So think news articles, popular science books, government reports, websites, that kind of thing. It's information that's publicly available, but hasn't necessarily gone through that rigorous academic peer review process.
And the gray literature is pretty enthusiastic about this language-brain health link.
Oh, absolutely. It's overwhelmingly positive. You constantly see headlines linking language learning to preventing dementia, boosting brain plasticity, sometimes even citing studies suggesting bilinguals have physically bigger brains, like one famous Swedish study on young military interpreters.
And there is that really startling claim, often repeated in the gray literature, about stroke recovery.
Yes, that's one of the most dramatic ones often cited. It suggested that bilingual individuals were twice as likely to recover cognitive function after a stroke compared to monolinguals. The implication being that those reinforced brain networks provided a much better backup system for recovery.
Wow, twice as likely. That implies a massive physical difference in brain resilience. But is the science actually settled on this? Or is this where we need a dose of caution, correlation versus causation and all that?
This is precisely where the deep dive needs that caution. While the cognitive reserve hypothesis is compelling and has good support, at least one major systematic review specifically questions the strength of the evidence, proving a definitive causal link between bilingualism and preventing dementia onset.
So it's more correlation. People who happen to be bilingual also tend to show dementia symptoms later, but we can't definitively say the bilingualism caused the delay.
That's the issue. It's very hard to prove causation definitively without very long-term, controlled, randomized studies, which are incredibly difficult and expensive to run for something like dementia. So much of the evidence remains correlational.
Okay, so if someone is, say, 70 years old and decides to start learning German right now, can they realistically bank on delaying Alzheimer's? Or is that maybe optimistic?
The evidence suggests we need to be cautious about promising that outcome, especially based on late-life learning alone. Timing, the duration of learning, and the intensity all seem to matter a great deal. It has to be genuine, sustained engagement.
Right.
Consider that study they mentioned involving older German monolinguals, aged between 65 and 80. They were put into a short, intensive Spanish course, just 90 minutes a day for 3 weeks.
Okay, that's pretty short.
Very short. And the results? They showed only very limited improvements in their executive functions. It wasn't enough to move the needle significantly.
So a 3-week language boot camp probably isn't going to build significant cognitive reserve.
Probably not. The intervention likely needs to be much more substantial and sustained over a longer period to really engage those reserve-building mechanisms. For policymakers thinking about programs for seniors, this is important. Funding short, scattered courses might feel good, but it's unlikely to deliver those major cognitive longevity results. This brain upgrade isn't a quick software patch. It's more like a long, ongoing system install requiring real commitment.
Got it. Okay, so we've covered the direct upgrades to memory, executive control, and the potential, albeit complex, health benefits. But what about how language learning interacts with other subjects, particularly for kids in school? Parents often worry, right? If my child spends time on French, won't their math suffer? Or their English writing? What does the research say to that worry?
That's a common anxiety, but the research generally suggests it's unfounded, especially in the longer term. There's actually good evidence for cross-curricular benefits. Skills learned in language class can transfer and boost performance in other core subjects.
Okay.
Now, there's a caveat here regarding the research itself. Much of the strongest evidence for this comes from studies on speakers of other languages learning English. The researchers themselves note that more studies specifically within English-speaking contexts, like the UK or US, would be really helpful to give local parents and policymakers clearer data.
But the principle of conceptual transfer, that seems solid. Can you give an example of how that works in practice?
Absolutely. One really interesting study looked at British Bangladeshi children in East London schools. These kids were encouraged to actively use their home language, their full linguistic repertoire, and the cultural knowledge embedded in it within the mainstream English curriculum.
So not suppressing their home language, but using it.
Exactly. And the results showed significant cognitive benefits. Crucially, they demonstrated conceptual transfer. They could take a concept they understood deeply in their home language context, maybe a complex idea about family or community, or even a grammatical structure, and apply that understanding successfully in their English mainstream classes, whether it was in history, social studies, or even understanding English grammar better.
That really challenges the old idea that schools should be strictly monolingual. Their entire linguistic background becomes a resource, not a deficit.
It's a resource. It's that plurilingual advantage we talked about. Now, addressing that specific parental worry about falling behind, what about immersion programs? Where a child might spend half their day learning math or science in another language, say Mandarin. Is there an initial hit to their English skills?
Yeah, does that split focus create a drag initially?
It can, initially. But the research strongly suggests this is often a case of a powerful delayed effect, leading to an even bigger payoff down the road. Take the Mandarin Immersion Program study cited in the report. In the early grades, grades 2 and 3, the immersion students actually scored lower on standardized English reading tests compared to their peers in the regular English mainstream program.
Okay, so a parent looking at those grade 2 scores might panic.
Exactly. They see a lag in a core subject and think, this isn't working. But fast forward to grades 4 and 5. By then, the Mandarin immersion students hadn't just caught up in English reading. They were consistently scoring above the English mainstream students.
Above, not just equal, but better.
Better. It seems the deeper analytical skills, the constant need for conceptual translation, the mental flexibility required by managing two languages in demanding academic contexts, that cognitive workout eventually more than compensated for the initial split focus.
Yeah.
It actually accelerated their overall English reading development in the long run.
Wow, so the immersion essentially built a more powerful underlying cognitive engine.
That seems to be the interpretation. And importantly, this pattern isn't just for privileged kids. It holds across different socioeconomic groups, which is vital for policy discussions. Another study looked at low SES Spanish-speaking students in the U.S. who were in dual-language immersion programs.
Yeah.
Eventually, they outperformed their Spanish-speaking peers who were in mainstream English-only programs, both in mathematics and in English achievement. The benefits were clearly there, but for these groups who might be dealing with more challenges outside school, the positive effect might just take a bit longer to fully emerge.
So patience is key, especially in early education policy. You can judge the success of immersion by looking only at the grade 2 scores. You need the longer view.
Precisely. Now, shifting slightly again, let's talk about the classics, Latin, Ancient Greek. These aren't languages you chat in over coffee.
Right.
They don't offer the same kind of obvious economic benefits as Mandarin or Spanish, yet they're highly valued academically. What are the cognitive benefits there?
I just remember Latin grammar feeling like brutal mental gymnastics. Is that basically it, the workout?
That's a huge part of it. The cognitive payoff from classical languages isn't about communication fluency. It's strongly linked to developing very high levels of metalinguistic awareness.
Metalinguistic awareness, meaning the ability to consciously think about language itself, its structures, its rules.
Exactly. And also exceptional cognitive transfer.
Okay, cognitive transfer, applying learning from one area to another. How does that work with Latin?
It works on multiple levels. There's near transfer, like using your knowledge of Latin grammar structures to learn Italian or Spanish more easily. But there's also evidence of far transfer, where the rigorous, logical, rule-based analysis you practice in decoding Latin sentences can actually transfer to seemingly unrelated fields like mathematics, formal logic, or even computer programming. It's the training in structured thinking that
It's the
transfers.
underlying analytical engine again.
It is. And this leads directly to teaching methods. Are we saying that those really old-school grammar drill-heavy methods, often used in classics, teaching the ones modern language teachers often dislike, actually have cognitive benefits, even if they're not great for making you conversationally fluent? That's precisely what the evidence suggests, surprisingly perhaps. The grammar translation method, focusing on intense analysis, parsing sentences word by word, memorizing declensions and conjugations.
Mm.
Yes, it's considered outdated for developing communicative competence in a modern language. It doesn't get you speaking quickly, but it's still widely used in classics. And the research links this method specifically to sharpening those mental faculties. It provides an intense workout for inductive reasoning, for grammatical sensitivity, for analytical skills, and for memory. It's a cognitive boot camp, essentially, training those core aptitude components we discussed earlier.
Okay, that's fascinating. Now, for something maybe even more surprising, creativity. When we think language learning, we think grammar, vocab,
Hmm.
not necessarily becoming more creative. Are foreign language learners actually measurably more creative?
Yes, this was identified as a key, broad cognitive benefit alongside resourcefulness and abstract thinking. And they didn't just guess this. Researchers tested it rigorously. They compared foreign language learners, FLLs, with monolingual students using a standardized test called the Torrance Test of Creative Thinking, the TTCT.
Ah, the TTCT. That's the gold standard for measuring divergent thinking, right? Your ability to come up with lots of different original ideas or solutions to a problem.
Correct. And the results were pretty clear-cut. The FLLs scored significantly higher than the monolinguals across multiple objective measures of creativity.
Like what specifically?
Things like verbal flexibility, coming up with different categories of ideas. Verbal originality, how unique or unusual the ideas are. Verbal fluency, just the sheer number of ideas. And similar measures on the figural or visual side too, like figural flexibility and figural originality. The pattern was consistent across several studies cited.
Okay, so the effect is real, but why? What's the mechanism? How does juggling French and English make you better at brainstorming novel uses for a paperclip?
The key seems to lie in how language learning forces abstract thinking. A major systematic review looking at the cognitive effects of bilingualism found that one of the strongest average effect sizes, a measure of how big the difference is, was for abstract and symbolic representation. The effect size was 0.57.
Okay, 0.57. For listeners who aren't stats nerds, how big is that in this kind of psychological research? Is that like noise or is it substantial?
Oh, in social sciences, an effect size of 0.57 is considered large.
Right.
It indicates a pretty substantial and reliable difference between the groups. It's definitely not just statistical noise.
Wow. So why does managing two symbolic systems, say English and Spanish, boost abstract thought and creativity so much?
Think about it this way. A monolingual brain typically has one primary label, one word, tightly bound to a concept, like dog.
Right.
But a plurilingual brain constantly manages multiple labels for the same underlying concept. They have dog, but also perro, maybe chin.
Yeah.
To communicate effectively, they constantly have to access the underlying concept of dogness first, and then select the appropriate label for the context.
Ah, so they can't just rely on the automatic link between the concept and a single word. They have to consciously manipulate the symbols.
Exactly. That constant process of mapping one concept to multiple symbols forces a separation between the concept itself and its linguistic representation. It forces you to operate at a more abstract level. You're not just thinking about the word, you're constantly navigating the relationship between words and the underlying abstract idea.
You're taking a conceptual detour, bypassing the concrete word link.
Precisely. And that regular cognitive exercise in abstraction primes the brain for more flexible divergent thinking in other areas too. It enhances your ability to see things from multiple perspectives, to break set patterns of thought, which is the very essence of creativity. It's cognitive transfer in perhaps its purest form.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've had the technical brain upgrades, memory, analysis, creativity, but language isn't just technical. It's deeply social, deeply emotional. How does being plurilingual change how we connect with others, how we see the world, maybe even how we make decisions? Let's start with empathy.
Empathy is interesting because it seems to work both ways. On the one hand, having a degree of empathy seems to be helpful for acquiring a language successfully. Some early, quite influential research suggested that empathy, your ability to sort of imaginatively put yourself in another person's shoes, is positively related to how well you can pronounce a second language, your L2,
Yeah.
authentically.
That's fascinating. You're linking a social emotional trait, empathy, directly to a physical skill, pronunciation. Like you need to mentally feel like the other speaker to sound like them.
Kind of. It's about being able to temporarily suspend your own linguistic framework and adopt another's, not just intellectually, but almost physically, vocally. And this idea gets some support from anecdotal reports, too. You often hear people who speak multiple languages say they feel like a different person when they switch languages.
Yeah, I've heard that.
That feeling, that slight shift in identity or persona, might reflect this need for empathy, for taking on a different perspective, which in turn helps achieve a more authentic linguistic performance, including pronunciation. You're adopting a new cognitive and emotional lens temporarily.
Okay, that's empathy. Now, shifting from feeling to thinking, this next one seems really counterintuitive, but it pops up in the gray literature quite a bit. The idea that thinking in a foreign language can actually make you more rational, especially in high-stakes situations like making financial decisions.
Yes, it sounds odd, doesn't it? But there's a plausible mechanism behind it. It relates to the idea of dual process theory in psychology System 1 and System 2 thinking.
Okay, refresh us quickly. System 1 is.
System 1 is your fast, intuitive, automatic, often emotionally driven thinking, your gut reactions.
Yeah.
System 2 is the slower, more deliberate, effortful, analytical thinking.
Right.
The hypothesis is that when you operate in a foreign or auxiliary language, AL, the extra cognitive effort required forces you out of that quick, potentially biased System 1 mode and into the more deliberate System 2 mode.
So because it's harder work mentally, I can't just rely on my instant gut feeling. I have to actually think it through more carefully.
Exactly. The very act of translating your thoughts, processing grammar, searching for vocabulary, it creates what's called cognitive distance. It filters out some of the immediate, raw emotion that often clouds judgment in your native language.
Mm.
You're forced into a more detached analytical frame of mind. And one source specifically highlighted how this could lead to better financial choices, because the emotional biases that might lead to impulsive spending or overly risky investments get dampened down by the effort of thinking in the AL.
That's amazing. So a practical tip. If you're facing a big emotionally charged decision, especially about money, try framing the pros and cons in your second language first. That little bit of cognitive friction might force a more rational outcome.
It forces you to lean more on logic and the available data, rather than just how you feel about it at the moment. Could be very useful in negotiations, too.
Definitely. Okay, let's consider a completely different kind of language learning now. Sign language. We know plurilingualism in spoken languages has benefits. Does learning a visual gestural language offer the same benefits? Or are there unique advantages tied to the modality itself, the fact that it doesn't use sound?
There are definitely unique modality-specific advantages that come with learning sign language. The research is pretty clear that learning to sign, even if you're a hearing person acquiring it as an adult, leads to enhanced visuospatial processing abilities.
That makes intuitive sense, right? You're constantly tracking hands, moving in three-dimensional space, interpreting shapes, locations, movements.
Precisely. It's a constant workout for the parts of your brain that handle spatial reasoning. For example, studies show that signers often have lower cognitive costs when dealing with mentally rotated stimuli. They can visualize and manipulate objects in their mind's eye more quickly and efficiently than non-signers. The language itself trains those spatial networks.
Okay, that's a clear benefit for the learner. But we need to address a common idea, especially regarding babies and sign language. There are lots of products and claims out there.
We absolutely do. It's important to be clear here. While you see many popular claims, often in that gray literature, again, that teaching signs to hearing infants significantly boosts their overall cognitive development, maybe increases IQ, or dramatically reduces frustration, the better controlled scientific studies haven't really borne those specific claims out.
So no guaranteed IQ boost from baby sign.
The rigorous research suggests that the observable benefits are generally those you'd expect from any form of rich, early parent-child interaction and communication. Giving babies a way to express needs before they can speak can reduce frustration, enhance bonding, absolutely. It provides more context for interaction. But the evidence doesn't support claims of a unique, sign-specific boost to general cognitive development or IQ beyond those interactional benefits.
That's a really important clarification for parents. It's about connection and communication, not necessarily about creating a smarter baby in some measurable cognitive sense.
Exactly. Now let's look at how learning a language affects how learners see themselves, their sense of capability. How does pursuing an additional language impact self-efficacy?
Self-efficacy, that's basically your belief in your own ability to succeed at something, right?
That's it. And the research consistently shows a positive link. Self-efficacy is positively associated with proficiency in an additional language, AL. Basically, as you get better, you feel more capable, and that increased confidence then motivates you to keep going and achieve more. It's a positive feedback loop.
That makes sense as a general psychological principle. But did the research find any interesting cultural variations in how this plays out? This seems like an area where culture could have a big impact.
It really does. This is where the cross-cultural data gets fascinating. Meta-analyses consistently found that students from East Asian and Middle Eastern backgrounds tend to report lower levels of self-efficacy compared to Western participants. They rate their own abilities more conservatively, perhaps more humbly.
Okay, maybe due to cultural norms around self-assessment or expressing confidence.
That's the likely interpretation, yeah. Cultural factors influencing self-reporting. However, and this is the crucial twist, when researchers looked at studies conducted within those specific regions, East Asia, Middle East, they found that the actual correlation, the link between self-efficacy and achieved proficiency, was often stronger for those students than for Western students.
Wait, so even though they report feeling less confident overall, their level of confidence, whatever it is actually a better predictor of how well they'll ultimately do compared to Western students.
That's what the data suggests. It's a fascinating paradox. Their internal belief system, even if expressed more modestly, seems to have a more potent connection to their actual learning outcomes. It really highlights how complex the interplay between culture, self-perception, and motivation is.
Definitely. Okay, one last piece in this social-emotional puzzle. Personality. Does your basic personality type predict how successful you'll be at learning a language? Do they look at the big five traits?
They did. Just to quickly remind listeners, the big five traits are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Got it.
The research found that the strongest positive correlations with L2 performance were for openness, with correlation coefficient R of 0.23, and conscientiousness R equals 0.18.
Okay, openness makes total sense. You need to be open to new sounds, new ways of thinking, new cultures, ambiguity. Why conscientiousness?
Well, think about it. Learning a language properly is a long haul. It requires consistent effort, organization, sticking to a plan, doing the homework, practicing regularly. It's hard work. So it makes sense that people who are naturally more disciplined, organized, and diligent conscientious would tend to do better.
So being diligent matters more than being, say, super outgoing or extroverted.
The correlation for extroversion was much weaker, surprisingly perhaps. Diligence seems a better predictor than sociability, according to this data. However, it's really important to stress, as the researchers do, that while these correlations exist, the R values, 0.23 and 0.18, are statistically significant but still quite low in absolute terms. Meaning personality explains only a small fraction of the variance in success. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that people with different personality profiles can't become successfully plurilingual. You don't need a personality transplant. But being open and conscientious certainly seems to give you a bit of an edge in sustaining the effort needed.
Right. Okay, so we've laid out this compelling case. Language learning boosts your brain power, your creativity, potentially your health, maybe even your rationality and empathy. The benefits are huge. So why do so many of us still quit? This section has to tackle the messy reality, the motivation that gets us started, the grit required to keep going, and that depressing phenomenon of language attrition, watching your hard-earned skills fade away.
Yeah, this is the reality check section. Motivation is consistently flagged as one of the absolute best predictors of success in learning an additional language, right up there with aptitude, which we now know is malleable,
Here.
and any prior language learning experience.
Okay. And the researchers break motivation down, right? Using this framework called the L2 motivational self-system.
That's right. It proposes three main components that fuel a learner's drive.
Let's walk through them. What's the first one?
First is instrumental motivation. This is the practical utilitarian stuff. Learning the language for a specific purpose. To get a better job, pass an exam, make travel easier, communicate with relatives. Tangible goals.
Makes sense. What's second?
Second is integrative motivation. This is more social and identity related. It's the desire to connect with speakers of the language, to understand or even identify with the target culture, maybe to become like certain successful speakers you admire. This ties into the idea of your ideal L2 self, the vision you have of your future successful language-using self.
Okay, practical goals, social identity goals.
Now,
What's the third?
the third component is simply the L2 learning experience itself. This captures the day-to-day reality of learning, how much you actually enjoy the classes, find the materials engaging, like the teacher, feel stimulated by the process. It's the intrinsic motivation derived from the activity itself.
And here again, we bump into those cultural differences influencing what kind of motivation is most powerful for different groups.
Absolutely. The research highlighted a tendency for Asian learners, for example, to be more strongly motivated by what's called their ought-to L2 self. This is driven more by external expectations, a sense of duty, avoiding failure, living up to what others, like family or society, expect of them.
Okay, whereas Western learners.
Western learners tend to be more driven by that ideal L2 self, their own personal aspirations, who they want to become through learning the language. And crucially, the research suggests that feeling pressured, being driven by that ought-to self and the fear of failure, is generally less effective for long-term success than cultivating a positive, proactive vision of your ideal L2 self.
So parental nagging or intense societal pressure might get you started, but it's not the best fuel for the long, hard journey.
The data indicates that a positive aspirational outlook focused on personal goals tends to be more sustainable and ultimately more successful than motivation based primarily on pressure or avoiding negative consequences. But now here's a really critical, maybe slightly disheartening finding for anyone mapping out their study plan.
Oh,
A major meta-analysis looked at the relationship between the amount of effort students said they intended to put into their language learning and how well they actually performed on objective language tests.
okay, so how much effort you plan to exert versus your actual results? What did they find?
They found a very, very weak relationship. The correlation coefficient, Jeff, was only 0.12.
0.12. That's
Wow.
tiny. That's almost no relationship at all. What does that even mean? If intending to study hard doesn't predict success, should we just give up planning? Does effort not matter?
No, it doesn't mean effort is pointless. What it strongly suggests is that the quality and focus of your effort matter vastly more than the sheer quantity of time you intend to spend.
Ah,
Think about it. Those students reporting high-intended effort might have been planning to spend hours passively highlighting textbooks or doing low-level drills that weren't actually challenging them or leading to real communicative practice. Just enjoying a course or planning to work hard doesn't automatically translate to high proficiency gains if the way you're studying isn't effective or if the engagement isn't deep.
so it's not about hours logged, it's about effective hours. Quality over quantity, that makes sense. It highlights why sometimes there's a disconnect between how hard we feel we're working and what objective tests show. Our effort might just be misplaced.
Precisely. And this leads us straight into two related concepts, grit and mindset. We know language learning takes sustained, quality effort over a long time. Are these traits grit, the right mindset fixed, or can they be developed too?
Yeah, you hear people say, oh, I just don't have the grit, as if it's set in stone.
Well, the research suggests otherwise. L2 grit, which is specifically about maintaining passion and perseverance for long-term language learning goals, and mindset, especially having a growth mindset, the belief that your abilities aren't fixed but can be developed through effort, are presented as malleable. They're not static traits you either have or don't have.
Malleable how?
The idea is that interventions, even just raising students' awareness about these concepts, can potentially help them develop more L2 grit and cultivate a growth mindset. So the struggle of learning a language might actually teach you how to be grittier, how to adopt a more productive mindset towards challenges.
So, becoming a more resilient, gritty person could be seen as another benefit of the language learning process itself, regardless of whether you reach fluency. The struggle itself builds character, essentially.
That's a key implication. You build resilience by navigating the inevitable plateaus, frustrations, and setbacks that are just part of learning any complex skill, especially language.
Okay, but inevitably, for many people, the active struggle stops. Maybe life gets in the way, motivation wanes, and then comes attrition, the depressing loss of those hard-won skills. What does the research tell us about how we forget languages? They mention dynamic systems theory, DST.
Yes, DST offers a useful lens here. It views attrition, which is defined as the normal, non-pathological decline in language proficiency, when you stop using it as a process that's complex, dynamic, and definitely non-linear. It's not just a simple, steady slide downwards.
Okay, complex, dynamic, nonlinear. DST also highlights something called sensitive dependence on initial conditions, What does that mean for someone who learned Spanish in college and hasn't touched it since?
It means that where you started from when you stopped using the language matters hugely. Even small differences in your initial proficiency level, the quality of your learning experience back then, or how deeply integrated the language was, can lead to dramatically different rates and patterns of forgetting over time.
So someone who reached a solid intermediate level might forget much slower than someone who just scraped through the beginner stage, even if they both stop using it for the same amount of time.
Exactly. Those initial conditions set the trajectory. Small advantages or disadvantages at the point you stop practicing can compound significantly over years of disuse. The foundation matters.
Okay. And are certain parts of the language more likely to decay first? Is it grammar, pronunciation,
Right.
vocabulary?
Vocabulary is consistently identified as the most vulnerable domain. Words, especially less frequent or more specialized ones, are much more susceptible to attrition compared to, say, your core phonological knowledge, how the language sounds, your morphology, how words are built, or the fundamental syntactic structures, grammar rules. Once grammar is truly deeply learned and proceduralized, it tends to stick around longer.
Okay, so vocab goes first. Can we break down the stages of that loss? If I learned Italian 10 years ago and haven't spoken it, what's likely happening to my mental dictionary right now?
The research suggests a few stages. Stage 1, retrieval just takes longer. The word is still in there, maybe on the tip of your tongue, but accessing it requires more conscious effort, more time.
What's the word for? Stage.
Exactly. Stage 2. The information becomes only partially accessible, often conditionally. You might recognize the word instantly if you hear someone else say it. Passive recall is okay, but you find you simply cannot produce it yourself when you need it. Active recall fails.
You know it when you see it, but you can't pull it out of thin air.
Precisely. And then stage 3. If the disuse continues long enough, the information might become effectively inaccessible, possibly even permanently lost, though true permanent loss is hard to prove. And here's the slightly alarming part. Significant attrition, especially in that retrieval speed, the stage 1, and active recall, stage 2, can start to set in surprisingly quickly, potentially within just 6 months of stopping regular use.
6 months. Wow, that's fast. Use it or lose it really applies here. What factors influence how much vocabulary you lose over time?
The single biggest protective factor seems to be your attained proficiency level when you stopped active use. That's the key initial condition. The higher you climb the proficiency ladder, the better buffered you are against rapid loss.
Mm-hmm.
One study on English learners found minimal lexical attrition, even with only infrequent contact later on, for those who had reached a high initial level. Their knowledge was just more robustly encoded. Intermediate learners, however, showed noticeably faster and more significant attrition.
Okay, initial level is key. Is there a certain type of vocabulary that disappears faster than others?
Yes, generally the vocabulary you learned most recently is the most vulnerable. Specialized terms, low-frequency words, things you haven't used much, they go first. There's also a hypothesis called the regression hypothesis, which suggests that things learned earlier might stick longer. Some interpret this to mean nouns, often learned early and easily, might actually be forgotten sooner than, say, core verbs or grammatical function words. But the evidence on specific word types is a bit mixed. One study, for instance, found no real difference in attrition rates between concrete and abstract nouns among students still using the language. But generally, the more foundational and frequently used a word was, the better its chances of survival.
The whole process sounds not just cognitively challenging, but emotionally taxing too. We talked about self-efficacy, but what about the raw anxiety of actually trying to speak, especially when you feel rusty or unsure?
That brings us to willingness to communicate, or WTC. This is a key variable. Research shows WTC is moderately correlated with a few things. Your perceived communicative competence, how good you think you are, your level of language anxiety, and your overall motivation.
And which of those has the biggest impact on whether you'll actually open your mouth and try?
Perceived competence seems to have the largest effect. If you feel like you can handle the interaction, even if imperfectly, you're much more likely to take the risk and speak. If you feel incompetent, your anxiety spikes and your willingness to communicate plummets.
And the report included some really powerful, almost heartbreaking qualitative feedback from young learners about this anxiety, didn't it?
It did. These quotes really underscore the huge emotional barrier language learning can present. One 10-year-old boy learning English described the feeling as like being swallowed by a whale because it's painful.
Wow.
And a 12-year-old girl compared learning English to eating green mustard because English is bitter and difficult.
Bitter and difficult, swallowed by a whale. Those are incredibly visceral images. We often focus on the academic side, the cognitive benefits, the future job prospects. But those quotes remind us just how high the emotional cost can be, especially for younger learners facing pressure. Is anxiety then potentially the single biggest obstacle to success? Maybe even more than aptitude or teaching quality?
It's certainly the biggest barrier to engagement and persistence. High anxiety directly crushes your willingness to communicate. If you're constantly terrified of making mistakes, you'll avoid speaking situations you won't practice, and your progress stalls, reinforcing the feeling of incompetence. It becomes a vicious cycle. These negative emotions are absolutely critical factors in why so many people abandon the journey, even when they intellectually understand and believe in the benefits we've been discussing.
Right. So, tackling that anxiety has to be central to any successful learning strategy or teaching approach. Okay, we've explored the individual's brain, their emotions, their learning journey. Now let's zoom out. Let's talk about the bigger picture. Policy, economics, public perception. Does all this individual cognitive benefit translate into something policymakers or employers actually value? Does learning Spanish make you more money?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. Economists view language skills as a form of human capital,
Human capital, meaning?
meaning it fits the definition.
Mm.
It's productive, it helps you do things, it's costly to produce, it takes time, effort, resources, and it's embodied in you, the person. It's an asset you carry with you. And this asset has demonstrable value in the labor market.
Okay. And this isn't just about working internationally. The benefits of being plurilingual, even within your own country, are measurable, especially if English is one of the languages involved.
They are significant and measurable, particularly if the additional language is a globally important one like English, even in non-English speaking countries. Several large European studies confirm this clearly. For instance, they found that in Germany, Italy, and Spain, knowing English significantly increased the probability of men finding employment by about 3.4% to 5.2%.
And for women?
For women, the effect was even slightly larger in Germany and Italy, boosting employment probability by 5.6% and 5.7% respectively.
Okay, that's employment probability. Can we actually put a number, like a percentage wage increase on it? That's the kind of concrete data that really makes people sit up and listen.
We can. A study specifically looking at the German labor market calculated that German native speakers who also had English proficiency earned, on average, 13% more than their peers who only spoke German.
13%. That's a substantial wage premium. And presumably these studies try to control for other factors like education level, job type, etc.
Yes. Good economic studies attempt to control for those major confounding variables, education, industry, years of experience, to isolate the specific effect of the language skill itself. So that 13% figure is a pretty robust indicator of the added economic value directly attributable to knowing English in that context.
That is a clear, quantifiable return on investment that definitely outweighs the cost of a language app or course. It's a powerful argument for individuals and for justifying education funding. But what if you're in an English-speaking country already? Everyone speaks English. Does learning another language, a lucha language other than English, still pay off financially?
It can, yes. In contexts where English is the default and widely spoken, knowing a lute sometimes commands an extra rarity premium.
A rarity premium.
Yeah. If you're in London or New York, basic English proficiency gets you in the door. It's the baseline. But if you also have fluency in, say, Mandarin or Danish or Arabic, that's a scarcer skill. If an employer needs that specific language for particular markets or clients, your rare skill set gives you leverage and can command an additional premium on top of your other qualifications simply because you're harder to replace.
Got it. So there's clear economic value. Which brings us to the frustrating part, the policy practice gap. Especially in English-speaking countries like the UK or Australia, we know the uptake of modern foreign languages, MFL, in schools is often worryingly low. Why the disconnect? The benefits are so clear, why isn't there more institutional investment?
It's a complex problem, but a big part of it seems rooted in the very dominance of English globally. In English-speaking contexts, policymakers often fall into the trap of focusing very narrowly on the end state of language skills.
What do you mean by end state?
They tend to ask purely functional questions, like, do we have enough graduates fluent in Mandarin to facilitate trade with China? Or, do we need X number of Arabic speakers for security roles? They view language solely as a vocational tool needed for specific, identifiable jobs right now.
And in doing so, they completely miss the broader cognitive benefits we've been talking about. The creativity boost, the better analytical skills, the cognitive reserve.
Exactly. They often overlook the profound cognitive enhancements that come from the process of learning any language. They fail to see language learning not just as job training for a few, but as foundational mental training that improves the overall human capital, adaptability, and cognitive capacity of the entire population, regardless of whether those individuals end up using that specific language professionally.
It's a failure of imagination, really. They're looking at the line item for Mandarin teachers in the budget and missing the fact that those classes are also producing students who might be better at math, better problem solvers, more creative thinkers because of the language struggle, even if they never speak Mandarin again after graduation.
That's the core of the policy failure in many places, missing the value inherent in the process, the struggle, the cognitive workout itself.
So given this policy inertia, what messages do educators on the ground feel would actually work? What would persuade policymakers and maybe anxious parents to finally prioritize language learning more?
The focus groups conducted with educators for this report were quite clear on this. They felt the most persuasive arguments would be those focusing on the cross-curricular benefits. Solid evidence showing that learning French improves performance in English, math, science, and the tangible employment benefits, like that 13% wage premium we discussed.
Immediate practical payoff.
Yes, things that resonate with parents' concerns about core academic achievement and future job prospects for their kids.
And which messages did the educators think were least effective or maybe even counterproductive?
They were generally skeptical about using the health and cognitive longevity benefits, like dementia prevention, as a primary selling point. They felt those benefits were too far off, maybe perceived as less reliable or harder to guarantee, especially for families focused on more immediate educational and economic outcomes for their children. It lacked the urgency needed to justify the significant effort involved in language learning.
That makes sense. And there's also a danger in policymakers trying to pick winning languages, isn't there? Trying to predict which languages will be strategically important in 10 or 20 years.
Absolutely. The educators strongly cautioned against focusing policy only on currently fashionable, strategically important languages like Mandarin or Arabic. They pointed out quite rightly that geopolitical and economic priorities shift. For example, they mentioned significant investment in Japanese language programs in the past that didn't necessarily yield the expected long-term economic payoff later on.
So their recommendation is
Promote language learning in general. Argue for the value of learning any additional language because the core cognitive, social, and cross-curricular benefits are largely universal. They apply whether you're learning Spanish, German, Urdu, or Swahili. Don't put all the policy eggs in one strategic basket that might be irrelevant in a decade.
promote the process, not just the product. Okay, finally, what about the general public? We know they quit often, we know there's anxiety, but do they fundamentally believe in the value of language learning?
Overwhelmingly, yes, according to the survey data. That survey of 741 adults showed incredibly positive attitudes. Yeah. A huge 99% said they would encourage their own children to learn new languages.
99%.
Yeah. And while 86% thought it's generally better to start learning when younger, a substantial majority, 72%, also believe that learning languages when you're older brings its own unique benefits.
So the belief in the value proposition is almost universal. People get that it's a good thing.
They absolutely do. Interestingly, 75% of the survey respondents themselves reported being fluent in other languages, which suggests the sample was perhaps skewed towards people already engaged with and positive about languages. But even within this highly engaged group—
There's still the anxiety factor.
Exactly. Even among these enthusiasts, a significant minority, 39%, reported having anxieties about language learning. So it perfectly highlights the core challenge. People know it's beneficial, they want the benefits, but the perceived difficulty, the fear of failure, the emotional hurdles involved in that long, hard journey remain very real barriers to starting and especially to persisting.
Okay, let's try and synthesize all of this. This deep dive has really shown, I think, that learning a language is so much more than just acquiring a practical communication tool. It's genuinely a profound investment in your brain's underlying architecture, an investment that pays dividends across your cognitive and even social life, compounding over time.
Absolutely. We're not just talking about ordering food. We're talking about a whole suite of upgrades, measurably boosting your creativity and abstract thinking, literally training your underlying aptitude to learn better, strengthening your cognitive functions against the effects of aging, and maybe even making you a bit more rational when you're looking at your bank balance.
And the absolute key takeaway, the message that needs to cut through the "I'm just not good at languages" myth, is malleability.
Yes. That feeling that your aptitude, your grit, your mindset are fixed characteristics is largely inaccurate, according to this research.
Yeah.
Your cognitive abilities, your capacity for perseverance, they can be developed. And the very process, the struggle of learning a language is one powerful way to develop them. Focusing on the process, setting small, achievable goals, rather than being overwhelmed by the distant peak of fluency, seems crucial.
You gain that resilience, that emotional flexibility, that grittier outlook just by showing up and engaging with the challenge day after day.
But the big but remains the gap between this compelling academic evidence and real-world policy and practice. We still need more large-scale, long-term studies to nail down some of the causal links definitively. The terminology is still messy, bilingual, plurilingual, making comparisons harder. And translating the strong evidence we do have into effective changes in schools and workplaces is proving stubbornly slow.
Largely because, as we discussed, policymakers often remain stuck on that narrow, short-term economic end state view, missing the much broader cognitive and human capital argument.
And that tension, the immediate tangible arguments versus the longer-term, harder to quantify cognitive ones, is where the policy debate needs to be won. The evidence suggests focusing on those cross-curricular boosts and the clear employment premiums might be the most effective wedge to open the door.
Okay, so let's leave our listeners with a final thought to chew on, especially as they maybe contemplate facing their own language learning anxieties again. Here it is. We know learning any language, even if you start young, is a long, hard slog. It demands serious perseverance. We know a huge part of winning that battle is psychological overcoming anxiety, maintaining belief in yourself. So, given all that, what single message do you think would finally convince a skeptical, perhaps budget-conscious, English-speaking policymaker to make a major sustained investment in mandated language education, not just for kids, but maybe for all ages? Would it be the promise of building long-term brain reserve against dementia, the lure of that immediate 13% wage premium for individuals, or the subtler but perhaps more profound argument about boosting fundamental metalinguistic awareness, creativity, and abstract thinking across the entire population?
Which lever finally unlocks that large-scale investment in human capital?
Exactly. Something for you to mull over next time you open that Duolingo app.